They called him Death Wind, a shadow in the trees, a ghost with a rifle. He moved without a sound, struck without mercy, and vanished before his enemies even knew he was there. On the lawless frontier, where every step could be your last, Louis Wetzel's name spread like wildfire, feared by those who crossed him, honored by those who stood behind him. He was a frontiersman, a scout, a man who knew the wilderness as well as he knew war. But was he a protector of his people, or a man consumed by bloodlust? A warrior? A killer? A legend? Or something else entirely? And where does a legend like this begin? My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Born in 1763, Louis Wetzel moved with his family to Western Virginia in 1770, where native raids were part of daily life. At 14, he learned what it meant to be hunted. Watching his younger brother play outside, he spotted a gun barrel near the corn crib. He moved too late. The shot ripped into his chest, and 2 warriors dragged him and Jacob away. No one saw them go. This was his first time tasting death. For 2 days they marched west. Wetzel bled but stayed quiet. Slow prisoners didn't last long. That night, the warriors made a mistake. They didn't tie the boys down. Wetzel waited, listened, then slipped into the dark with Jacob. But bare feet wouldn't take them far. So he went back. He stole moccasins, then a rifle. Then he ran. The warriors were fast. But by dawn, they were closing in. Wetzel played the game, misleading, doubling back, vanishing into the brush. But they didn't quit. By midday, they were nearly on them again. At the Ohio River, the boys lashed logs together, crossed, and stumbled onto safe ground. They had won. But Wetzel's war had just begun. The frontier was more than home, it was his hunting ground. He read the land like a book, knew the rivers, the trees, the wind. But beauty meant nothing when death was waiting right around the corner. And nowhere was safe. During the American War of Independence, after Crawford's defeat in 1782, a rattled Thomas Mills returned to Wheeling with a story. He had abandoned his horse at Native Spring, 9 miles away, and wanted it back. Wetzel warned him, too dangerous. Mills didn't listen. They went anyway. When Wetzel saw the horse tied to a tree, he knew. A trap. Mills stepped forward. A rifle cracked. Mills dropped. The woods exploded with war cries. Wetzel ran. 4 warriors chased him, sure he was finished. They were wrong. Half a mile in, the fastest caught up, his tomahawk raised. Wetzel spun, fired, and the man crumpled. Without slowing, he reloaded on the run. Another grabbed for his rifle. They hit the ground hard. The warrior was strong, nearly tearing the gun away. Wetzel twisted, jammed the barrel under his chin, and fired. 2 down. The last pair hesitated. Wetzel slowed, daring them forward. One ducked behind a tree, not wide enough. Wetzel's rifle cracked. The man staggered, bleeding. The last warrior turned and ran, screaming, "No chase that man! Him gun always loaded!" They learned what many had before. Wetzel was never easy prey. By summer 1786, the frontier burned. A settler had been killed at Mingo Bottom. Retaliation came swift. Major McMahon called for men, 100 for the first native scalp. To some, a fortune. To Wetzel, irrelevant. He wasn't in it for the money. On August 5th, they crossed the Ohio, pushing toward the Muskingum. 5 scouts moved ahead and found the enemy camp. Too many warriors, no chance of victory. The decision was clear: retreat. Wetzel didn't move. Sitting on a log, rifle across his knees, he spoke without looking up. "I came to hunt natives. Now that I've found them, I'm not going home sucking my thumb. I'm taking a scalp, or I'm losing my own." The others left him there, alone, surrounded by men who wanted nothing more than to see him fall. He didn't care. His only friend was his rifle, his only guide, the stars. As darkness fell, he moved carefully, sticking to deep woods, avoiding war parties. No fire. He made do, burying dry bark under dirt, letting it smolder beneath him for warmth. No smoke, no light, no sign a man was there. The next evening he found them, 2 warriors, camp set, unaware they were being watched. Wetzel melted into the brush and waited. At sunset, one returned, stoked the fire, and ate. The other arrived soon after. They laughed, talked, sang, completely at ease. They didn't know Wetzel was 20 feet away, crouched in the dark. Around midnight, one stood, grabbed his rifle, and disappeared into the trees, carrying a chunk of fire, probably heading for a deer lick, the smoke keeping mosquitoes off. Wetzel wasn't too happy about that. This wasn't the plan. He had them both right there. Now one had slipped away. He waited, hoping the man would return, but as dawn neared, Wetzel knew he couldn't wait. He moved in. The remaining native was curled on his side, deep in sleep. Wetzel struck the native, ending him in an instant. A single jolt, a final breath, then silence. He left his mark, wiped his blade clean, and vanished before the sun broke the horizon. By the time he reached Mingo Bottom, his companions had already returned. But Wetzel came back with a scalp. The kill was his, and so was the reward. The frontier had 1,000 tricks, and Wetzel knew them all. One of the deadliest was the turkey call. More than once, men had disappeared after hearing a lone turkey cry from the woods. Wetzel had his suspicions, natives using the call as bait. He set out to prove it. East of the creek, 60 feet above the water, was a cave nearly hidden by vines. From inside, a man could see across the hills, a perfect ambush point. Wetzel crept up and inspected the site, exactly what he expected. This was where the hunters had lured their prey, where men disappeared without a sound. A blind, a graveyard in waiting. The frontier had its killers. Wetzel was just better at it than most. Wetzel knew the cave, knew exactly where to find it. Before dawn, he slipped through the brush, circling wide to approach from the rear. He picked his spot, a clear view of the entrance, hidden in the shadows. And then he waited. Minutes passed. Then a warrior's head rose from the cave's mouth, eyes scanning the trees. He let out a sharp cry, a signal. Wetzel's rifle was already up. One smooth trigger pull. The shot cracked through the forest. The warrior dropped instantly, his body collapsing against the rock behind him. That turkey wouldn't be calling anymore. Whether others used the cave again, no one knows. But Wetzel had made his point. Every fall he made his own kind of hunt, deep into enemy territory, alone, armed, and looking for trouble. This time he pushed to the Muskingum and found it. A small native camp, 4 warriors, fast asleep around a dying fire. He crouched in the darkness, 4 to 1, tough but not impossible. Midnight came. A wolf howled in the distance. Then, like a shadow, Wetzel moved, rifle in one hand, tomahawk in the other. He set the rifle against a tree, drew his knife, and stepped forward. Silent, cold, lethal. His blade struck true. The first man never even made a sound before collapsing. A second step, a second stroke. Another fell without waking. The third barely had time to gasp before Wetzel's blade silenced him. The fourth, he ran. Wetzel gave chase, but the darkness swallowed the man whole. No matter. He returned to the camp, gathered his trophies, and started the long trek home. When he got back, someone asked if he had any luck. "Not much," he replied. "Treed 4 natives. 1 got away. 70 miles out, 70 miles back, just another day's work." Another time, caught in a storm near Wheeling, Wetzel took shelter in an abandoned cabin. He climbed into the loft, gathered a few broken boards for a bed, and settled in. Then, movement. 6 natives. They entered, lit a fire, and started cooking. Wetzel, knife in hand, didn't move. If they spotted him, he had one chance: drop in the middle of them and fight his way out. He steadied his breath, but they never looked up. One by one, they finished eating and stretched out by the fire. Soon their breathing deepened. Wetzel didn't hesitate. He crawled from the loft, slipping into the shadows. He pressed himself against the logs near the door, fingers tight around his blade. Now it was his turn to hunt. At dawn, a native stepped outside, stretching in the cool air. He never saw it coming. Wetzel's rifle cracked. The warrior crumpled, the morning silence broken. By the time the sound faded, Wetzel was gone, slipping into the wild. At age 25, he tried soldiering under General Harmar in Marietta, Ohio. It didn't suit him. Rules, discipline, none of it fit. He left for Wheeling but returned as a scout. That's when everything changed. Among the visiting natives was a warrior named George Washington, respected, trusted, untouchable. Harmar wanted peace. Wetzel didn't care. He shot the man dead. The outrage was instant. Harmar had him arrested and locked in irons. Wetzel didn't deny it. When questioned, he offered a solution. "Turn me over to the natives. Put their best warriors in a circle. Let them have tomahawks. I'll take one too. Let's see who walks away." Harmar refused. This wasn't the frontier. This was the army. The law would decide his fate. Days passed. Wetzel paced like a caged animal. He sent another message. "I can't live like this. Let me walk." Harmar relented. His feet were freed, but his hands stayed shackled. He was allowed to walk the grounds, always under guard. That was all he needed. At first he played dumb, darting a few steps, laughing, stopping. He pushed farther each time. Then, in a blur of raw speed, he was gone. The guards hesitated, then fired. Too late. He was already in the trees. They chased him, but they never had a chance. He knew the land. They didn't. Wetzel ran 2 miles before plunging into a thicket, squeezing beneath a fallen tree. He lay still. The hunt was on. Soldiers and native scouts swept the forest. Hours passed. Then, footsteps. 2 warriors climbed onto the very log hiding him. Wetzel's heart pounded. They howled for others, searching but never looked close enough. As night fell, they moved on. Now came the real challenge. The Ohio River stood between him and safety. The banks were swarming with guards. His only hope was a friend's cabin on the Virginia side. No raft, no boat, just open water and iron shackles. Could he make it? Maybe, maybe not, but he'd rather drown than go back. So he jumped. The current dragged at him, but he kicked hard, floating on his back, inching across. By the time he crawled onto the Virginia shore, he collapsed, barely able to move. Eventually, he made his way to his friend's cabin. A hammer and file freed him from the irons. He was safe. For now. But Harmar wasn't finished. Furious over Wetzel's escape, he sent men in a canoe to drag him back, but Wetzel and his allies were waiting. As the boat neared shore, rifles leveled from the bank. The warning was simple: step out and you die. Harmar's men thought it over. Then they turned around. With fresh weapons and supplies, Wetzel headed home, but the price on his head kept climbing. Captain Kingsbury was next to try. He moved in on Mingo Bottom, expecting an easy capture. He was dead wrong. One eyewitness put it best: a company of men could as easily have dragged Old Horny out of the bottomless pit as taken Lewis Wetzel by force from Mingo Bottom. Kingsbury made his move while a shooting match was underway at Wetzel's father's place. The settlers were in no mood for legal niceties. Talk of hanging a man for killing a native had them ready to spill blood. The plan was simple: ambush Kingsbury's boat and leave no survivors. It took Major McMahon to stop them. He warned Kingsbury straight: try to take Wetzel, and he'd have every settler in the region gunning for him. Kingsbury got the message and turned back. Wetzel figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. Downriver in Maysville, Kentucky, he was drinking in a tavern when trouble found him. A lieutenant named Lawless, passing through with soldiers, spotted him. Unlike Kingsbury, Lawless didn't bother with threats. He rounded up his men, stormed the tavern, and threw Wetzel in irons. No trial, no warning, just cold steel and a hard shove onto a boat. By nightfall, Wetzel sat in a Fort Washington cell, bound hand and foot like a common criminal. The news hit the frontier like a lightning strike. Captured for killing a native? Outrage exploded. Every settlement along the Ohio bristled with loaded rifles. Petitions poured in, but when Harmar ignored them, men started forming militias. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing to take Wetzel back. Harmar saw the writing on the wall. He wasn't about to start a war over one man. Wetzel walked free. He returned a hero. The settlers treated him like a king, his list of kills proof of his courage. The persecution only made him more beloved. As for Harmar, his reputation never recovered. The man who once commanded fear now inspired nothing but contempt. He had tried and failed to leash death wind. No one ever tried again. If Harmar had even half of Wetzel's nerve, his men might not have been slaughtered in the Miami campaign. But Wetzel didn't waste time on failures, his own or anyone else's. Not long after Kentucky, he set out for Dunkard Creek with a relative hunting along the way. The journey was easy until they arrived. The homestead was gone, burned to the ground. Wetzel crouched, scanning the ground. The signs were clear: 3 natives, 1 white man, and a captive. The captive was the young man's fiancée. He was ready to charge into the woods, but Wetzel caught his arm. If they're heading for the river, we cut them off. The raiders had tried to hide their trail, but Wetzel wasn't just tracking. He was thinking like them. He knew their route, knew they'd make for the Ohio fast. Instead of following footprints, he angled for the crossing point. They pushed hard, eating on the move. By nightfall, thick clouds choked the moon, forcing them to wait. At dawn, they picked up the chase, coming off a ridge into untouched valley land. Then, in the soft earth, they found what they needed: tracks. Among them, a small shoe print. The young man stiffened. "That's hers," he said. They followed persistently, over hills and streams, the trail barely visible, but never lost. By sunset, they reached the Ohio. Across the water, firelight blinked. The girl was still alive. That was all Wetzel needed. They swam across, silent. The young man wanted to rush in, but Wetzel stopped him. "We wait for daylight," he instructed. At dawn, the camp stirred. Wetzel gave the order: "You take the white one. I'll take a native." 2 shots cracked. 2 bodies fell. The young man ran to free the girl while Wetzel reloaded, eyes on the woods. 2 natives fled. He needed to know if more waited. He fired once, high into the trees. The warriors sprang out, screaming, tomahawks raised. They thought they had him. Wetzel didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just reloaded. One was nearly on him when he spun, fired. The warrior slipped and dropped. The second came harder, thinking Wetzel was done. Wetzel moved fast, ducking between trees, his hands smooth and practiced. When his rifle was ready, he stopped, turned, fired. The last warrior fell. And just like that, it was over. Not long after, Wetzel vanished south, taking a flatboat to New Orleans. Months passed without word. Then news came. He was in prison, shackled. A felon? Some said counterfeiting, others a Spaniard's wife. The truth never surfaced, but it didn't matter. No trial, no justice, just chains and 2 years in a cell. When the U.S. government finally stepped in, he was released and then sent north through Philadelphia. He then made his way home, but the man who returned wasn't the same. The time in chains had changed him. Leaner, harder, his anger sharpened to a fine edge. He spent just 2 nights on Wheeling Creek, one with his mother, another at Captain Bonnet's. He spoke of the humiliation, the injustice. But what ate at him most was betrayal. Someone had given him up. He swore revenge. In Wheeling, he stayed with George Cook, a relative. Mrs. Cook teased him about marriage. Wetzel only shook his head. "No woman in this world for me," he said. "Maybe one in heaven." Then, without a word, he was gone. South again. No one knew what happened next. Did he find the man who'd wronged him? Did he settle the score? History doesn't say. But one thing was certain. Wetzel was still the same man. Restless. Hunting. Deadly. However, even the best hunters slip. North of the Ohio River, after a long hunt, he let his guard down. A flicker of movement, a native raising a rifle. Both men dived behind trees, staring each other down. An hour passed. Neither moved. Wetzel had no patience for waiting. He fixed his buckskin cap to the end of his ramrod, easing it out just enough to mimic the peak of a head. The trap was set. A crack split the silence, the bullet tearing through the cap. Before the native could reload, Wetzel charged. His rifle roared, dropping the man where he stood. Another hunt, another kill. This time his name spread far beyond Wheeling. He was a frontiersman, a survivalist, a scout, a man you wanted when the woods turned hostile. Land speculators hired him as a bodyguard, unwilling to risk native country alone. One of them was John Madison, brother of future President James Madison. Madison needed a guide through the Kanawha, deep and dangerous land. Wetzel took the job. All went well until they found an abandoned camp, blankets, tools, supplies left behind in a hurry. They took what they needed and moved on. That afternoon, crossing the Little Kanawha River, gunfire erupted. A hidden war party ambushed them. Wetzel hit the ground fast. Madison wasn't so lucky. A bullet found him, and he went down. Wetzel didn't wait to die beside him. He disappeared into the trees. In Kentucky, too, his name carried weight. General George Rogers Clark, the man who had taken Kaskaskia and Vincennes, wanted him for a new expedition. Meriwether Lewis, of Lewis and Clark fame, was involved. They needed a man who knew the wild. A messenger rode out to find him. Wetzel wasn't interested in glory, but eventually he agreed. For 3 months he traveled with them through unknown lands, pushing the edge of the frontier. Then, as suddenly as he joined, he changed his mind. Without a word, he turned around and went home. Louis Wetzel never stayed put for long. One day, he took a flatboat downriver and never returned. Some say he died in the wild. Others believe he vanished into the west, living out his last days far from the settlements that once depended on him. What's certain is that when Death Wind disappeared, the frontier lost one of its deadliest shadows. By 1808, however, Wetzel had drifted into Mississippi, staying with a relative near Natchez. That's where the official story ends, dead of fever, buried in an unmarked grave. But Wetzel was never the type to go quietly. If you ever laid eyes on him, you wouldn't forget. Dark skin, jet black eyes that burned like embers, and a wild stare that could unnerve even the toughest warrior. His thick raven-black hair ran past his knees when let loose, a trophy the natives would have given a dozen warriors to claim. For all his reputation, Wetzel wasn't just edge and steel. He was blunt, rough, and kept to himself, but with friends he was fiercely loyal. If he called you a friend, you had nothing to fear. If he called you an enemy, you wouldn't have long to regret it. Officially, Wetzel died in Natchez. His bones were later dug up in 1942 and moved to West Virginia. But some say history got it wrong. Author Alan Eckert believed he lived much longer, settling along the Brazos River in Texas with a Spanish wife, maybe someone else's wife. If true, he didn't die in 1808, but in 1839, far from the frontier he once ruled. Yet whether he died at 23 or slipped away to Texas, his name was already legend. His brothers carried on his war, hunting natives without mercy. In villages, Wetzel was a name spoken in whispers, feared, hated, never forgotten. To the tribes, they weren't men. They were executioners. Did he cheat history one last time? We'll never know. The history books barely mention him now. Too violent, too messy. He doesn't fit the cleaned-up version of the past we're told to believe. But the frontier wasn't clean. It was brutal, bloody, and unforgiving. And Wetzel was a product of that world. To the Shawnee, he was Death Wind, fast, silent, and merciless. To the settlers, he was a protector. To others, a killer, no better than the warriors he hunted. But love him or hate him, his name still rides the wind.